Bienvenidos, welcome everyone, and happy Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm Maria Ramos Sagasti, and I lead the building capacity efforts of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. We're very excited to be hosting today's webinar on understanding and measuring Latino racial and ethnic identity. We're so happy that you're here with us today. We know that this topic has generated a lot of interest, and we're thrilled to see that so many people registered to join us. And before we begin, I'd like to go over some logistics quickly. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you can type in questions for the panelists in the question box, and we're going to try to address as many of these as possible during the Q&A section. And finally, the webinar will be recorded and available on our website later on, so you can go back to it at a later time. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so please tweet. And if you have your phone nearby, you can use this QR code to let others know that you're watching us and that there's still time for them to join us. And if you like what you hear today, please tweet about it. And when you do so, please use the hashtag NRCHComunidad and our Twitter handle NRCHispanic in your tweets. And lastly, before we dive in, a quick disclaimer that the views expressed in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the views of our funder, the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, so today we're talking about conceptualizing and measuring Latino racial and ethnic identity. And we're discussing this topic because for many Latinos, myself including, this is a very tough question to answer because the response options that we often get don't quite represent us. I, for example, was born and raised in Puerto Rico. So when people ask me about my racial or ethnic identity, I automatically think, well, I'm Puerto Rican. And in Puerto Rico, you grow up hearing over and over again that Puerto Ricans are a mix of white, Black, and indigenous people. But how much do we have of each? Who knows, right? So when I'm asked about my race, it's hard for me to respond to that question. And my response to the question has changed over time. And this is because racial and ethnic categories are social constructions, and our identification is shaped by our own experiences and our interactions with other people. So when I lived in Puerto Rico, I usually selected white fairly confidently, as this is the group that I mostly identified with. But now I'm very well aware of the fact that others don't perceive me as white. So I pause when I get this question, and sometimes I mark some other race, sometimes I mark white, and sometimes I leave it blank. And this question is not trivial. Adequately capturing race and ethnicity in the census and other federal data is important because race data allows us to understand the demographic characteristics of the population. And this question is also critical in advancing racial and ethnic equity, as these data allow researchers to examine subgroups in the population, and the data are also used to allocate government funding for programs, policies, and services for specific groups, and to monitor compliance with anti-discrimination laws, regulations, and policies, and finally, to help determine the number of seats in Congress. And if all of these reasons aren't enough, getting this question right in the census is important because researchers often turn to the census to determine how to ask about race and ethnicity in their studies. So it sets standards for future research, and it becomes the default question that people use and expect to see. And this conversation is very timely as the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which sets the standards for collecting and presenting data on race and ethnicity for all reporting, is currently reviewing its standards and has launched public listening sessions. So people are thinking and talking about this right now, and there's an opportunity for the public to provide input. So our goals today are, number one, to address conceptual issues surrounding the measurement of race and ethnicity in Latino populations. So why is it so difficult to measure race and ethnicity among Latinos? The second goal is to address challenges with current approaches that are being used to assess race and ethnicity in Latino populations. And finally, to offer alternatives for measuring racial and ethnic identity more accurately, including the measurement of mixed race identity. And we're delighted to have two amazing panelists today who have led efforts to reconceptualize how we measure Latino race and ethnicity in surveys and in the census. Our first panelist is Dr. Julie Dowling. She's an associate professor of sociology and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she previously chaired the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. Our second panelist is Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez, and he's a director of race and ethnicity research at Pew Research Center, where he leads planning of the center's research agenda focused on documenting the diverse, ever-changing racial and ethnic landscape of the United States. So we're going to start with Dr. Julie Dowling, who's going to talk to us about how the census has measured race and ethnicity, her work on how Latinos think about race, and proposed changes to current census questions. Julie?
Great. Thank you so much, Maria, for that wonderful introduction and for also sharing sort of your personal story on this. Your story of coming to the forum and struggling to answer it is so much of what my research has been about. Since you introduced a little bit about yourself, I'll tell you all to start with, I have a mixed Mexican and Irish background and originally from Texas. And so boxes and forms have always interested me precisely for that reason, right? That you come to them and you want to know how you're supposed to answer that form and trying to see yourself reflected in forms. Next slide, please. So basically what I'm going to talk about is I was involved, as Maria said, in the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee for 6 years, chairing it through the 2020 census and offering a lot of advising on how we measure race and ethnicity through my own scholarship and research and advocacy on that. So we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk today about the census racial options, how they're basically inadequate, as Maria talked about, for oftentimes capturing how people want to label themselves on the form. This creates a problem as people don't see themselves reflected in the racial options and then sometimes struggle to be able to answer that. And anything that's a barrier to you filling out your census form is going to be a problem, right? It's going to lead to undercounts. And this is such important data that we need. And the information is used for all of the reasons that Maria went over regarding congressional seats, these kinds of things. And so it's really important for people to fill this out and to see themselves reflected so that they can do so. So how do we fix this? We're working to change the racial options to sort of be more inclusive so that Latinos can better see themselves on the form and better be able to fill it out. Next. So in the most recent census, Latino populations were 18.7% of the US population, the largest population group after non-Hispanic white. There is currently no racial option for us on the form if you identify as Latino Hispanic, right? There are racial options there if you are someone who considers yourself Black and Latino or white and Latino, and you want to put that for your race. But for those people, many of whom do not see themselves in those other categories, there isn't a box that fits you. Rather, there's a separate Latino Hispanic origin question. Next slide. So here's basically what the census form looked like roughly for about 4 decades, having 2 separate questions with the Latino Hispanic origin first and the race question second. Originally, actually, they were reversed and they switched it over, long story behind that. But basically, there's a Latino Hispanic origin question that emerged originally on the census long form in 1970 and then on all census questionnaires in 1980. For a fantastic book that details the history of the development of that question, please see Dr. Cristina Mora's Making Hispanics. It's an excellent book that sort of covers the development of that question. This question was developed because activists and policymakers out there wanted data on our communities. They wanted data on Latino population, and at the time, basically, we were collapsed in with the white population, and there was no way to really measure that. So if you're somebody who's studying Latinos and you want data on educational inequality, data on health issues, et cetera, and they're basically, people aren't asking if someone is Latino Hispanic at all, it's just being collapsed in with white. How do you talk about discrimination and issues for your community without the data to be able to back that up? And so all of these activists came together to try to create something, and they lobbied the Census Bureau to put this on here. And there was a lot of conversation about how that would happen that she discusses also, Dr. Mora in the book, about whether or not this would basically be a race or an origin box. And he eventually was settled on this largely because of the politics at the time, right? So there is nothing that really makes our group a origin or ethnicity group versus all of these other groups. If you look at these, all these Asian national origins, et cetera. So it's not like there's really, what I explain to people sometimes when I present on this is we have 2 colors on here, white and black, basically. Everything else is kind of national origin or political, et cetera, identities. These are not all basically categories that are just based on skin color. Also, please notice on the form that whites and blacks in this previous setup of the form, 2010 and before, are not asked on the census questionnaire what their ethnic origins are. Now, there was in the American Community Survey something in the long form of the census previously, but on the form that goes out to everyone are not asked that. So when you look at this question, then what does that also tell people? Latinos are from somewhere else. Asians are from somewhere else. Whites and blacks are not assumed to be from somewhere else. It's like they're just quote unquote American and not having origins from outside of this country. Also note that there's no Middle Eastern option. So basically, in this form, 97% of response to other race will end up being Latino Hispanic. That other 3% are often Middle Eastern individuals who also don't see themselves reflected, many of them, in the categories that are available. Next slide. So the issues with the separate question format. So 13% of Latinos didn't even answer the race question in basically in 2010. And so they just left it blank altogether. 37% wrote in that Latino under like other race. So you have almost 50% not giving what's considered to be a census recognized racial category. Multiple studies have shown that when Latinos identify their race in this separate questions format, where you have Hispanic Latino origin versus race versus racial background, that it doesn't really match how they actually label themselves, because many of them would prefer to indicate themselves as being Latino Hispanic or their national origin. Next slide. So I wanted to do some research on this, basically. I started this 2 decades ago as a graduate student. I wanted to look at who is checking what on the census, particularly looking at Mexican Americans in my home state of Texas. So I was interested in, why are Latinos identifying as white? Are they identifying for the same reason as white as European Americans would? Does this mean the same thing to them? Does whiteness for Latinos mean assimilation and inclusion, as it has in the past for European Americans? Does racial otherness, what does that mean for them? Does it mean they're excluded? Does it mean they're not assimilating? Does it mean that they have a different way of seeing race, which some scholars have proposed? What also, you can claim that you're white on the census, but are you accepted as white by others? Like, what does this actually mean in their lives, basically? What does racial identification as whiteness for Mexican Americans in Texas, which was my study, mean for them? Next slide. So I interviewed 86 individuals, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, in 3 locations in Texas. I selected 2 border towns and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is actually where I'm originally from. And so why the regional focus and why Texas? Besides, I had a lot of background and knowledge in the area, that's where I'm originally from. But basically, like, Texas has the 2nd largest Latino population in the country. Like, basically nearly 1 in 5 people of Latino origin live in the state of Texas in this country. And also, whereas when I ran data, whereas on the nationally, you might find higher income associated with whiteness, on the census form, I actually found that in Texas, those in the lowest income brackets were most likely to label themselves as white. I also found some really extreme regional variation in Texas with regard to racial reporting, which I'm going to show you. Next slide. So this map basically indicates those who labeled as other race are the darker areas, and those who labeled as white are the lighter areas. And so what you can see here basically is a wave of whiteness all along the US-Mexico border. This is using the 2010 census data. I found the same thing in 2000 originally, and I redid it with the 2010. And I look forward to seeing what I might be able to do with the new data that's coming out for 2020. But basically, you see this wave of whiteness all across the border here. And if you've been to these areas, which my mother's family is originally from the Mission McAllen area, you know that they're not necessarily lighter skinned individuals living in these places. These are close to the Mexico border. People speak Spanish. It's not necessarily going to be assimilation. Politically too, those are very Democrat oriented, despite the fact that there was some changes in our last election. These are still overwhelmingly Democrat oriented counties. So what is it we're seeing here? You know, if it's not color, if it's not these other things that people typically link to whiteness, what is it about? It's what I wanted to investigate. Next slide. So what I found was, in brief, is that for Mexican Americans in Texas, the identification as white versus other race was not reflective of skin color for my respondents, nor was it reflective of cultural assimilation, like that those who checked white were less likely to speak Spanish, you know, et cetera, or more less likely to identify with their cultural heritage and communities. It also didn't really correlate with experiences of discrimination. Some of the older individuals I interviewed who checked white had some of the most profound experiences with Jim Crow style segregation in Texas, yet they still checked white for their race. Rather, what I found was linked to this was racial ideology. Those people who checked white on the census wanted to assert they're American to the US government. They wanted to basically assert a colorblind ideology, basically saying that they didn't name race, that they could somehow stop this and be more accepted in society. So basically, they didn't call themselves white in their daily lives. No one in my study did. They're checking white because they're telling the government that they are white. It's like a defensive whiteness. And there's a long history of this within our community, within the Mexican American community, from the history of the League of United Latin American Citizens in the 1920s, who originally petitioned to remove the Mexican category from the census. They did so in the face of discrimination. They wanted to basically fight to be included and to be considered as full, quote unquote, Americans, which they thought of as linked to whiteness. So we still see elements of this discourse that's there in our communities, that claiming whiteness is a way of claiming citizenship and Americanness in our society. Next slide. A number of other studies have found similarly that checking your race on the boxes for the census in that separate questions format where there is no Latino Hispanic option doesn't always match people's skin color in the way that we might think of basically in the United States. We tend to associate these with skin color. So Clara Rodriguez's work, for example, she interviewed Caribbean and South American Latinos in New York City. She found that most saw race as a cultural or political identity. Think of Maria's comment earlier. I see myself as Puerto Rican. I would want to check Puerto Rican, right? So not only certainly in a biological sense that people are thinking of their skin color, but thinking of their national origin and their culture and their community as a way of checking their race. So she found that people who checked other race weren't necessarily darker skinned, but they wanted to identify their national origin for their race. Wendy Ross research as well on Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in New York, she found basically that checking what people checked for their race didn't often map onto their identities basically in terms of their personal identities in their lives or how they were seen by other people. She called this a racial mismatch that occurred here basically. Next slide. So the Census Bureau has been trying to do something about this, particularly because the anticipation was in the next census that other race would then become the second largest racial group in the country. What was meant to be sort of a residual to capture a few people not counted had become such a large population. And so they wanted to do something to have people better reflected in the census and better able to answer the form to stop the unanswered questions and the confusion around it. So they created an alternative questionnaire experiment with the 2010 census. And so almost 500,000 respondents in the census in 2010 received an alternative questionnaire. Instead of their regular census, they got a sample basically that the Census Bureau was testing out. They repeated something like this in the 2015 with a national content test as well, where they also gave people a combined race and origin question. So in this alternative questionnaire experiment in the national contest, they gave them a format basically where you had a check all that apply model. And they tried different wordings of it, race and origin, categories, et cetera, eventually settled on just saying which of these boxes apply to you, like which categories apply to you. And in that, Latino Hispanic was listed alongside all of the other groups in a check all that apply format. When they did this, they then called individuals in the AQE and in the national content test and asked them, you checked white for your race, or you checked other for your race, or you checked black for your race. Is this how you would actually identify yourself in your daily life? And they looked at that. They found a much better match when you had a combined question format. If people checked white in the separate questions format, much like what my respondents told me, they didn't actually identify as white in their daily lives. But they did if they checked it in the combined format. It meant something to them. So when people have the option to say that they are Latino Hispanic origin, in the format, then those people can just check that. And if you also see yourself as white or black or anything else, you can check those boxes. I should also note the national content test added a Middle Eastern North African category for those individuals as well. And so that was also a possibility that was to be included in the 2020 census that we did not get. Next slide. Okay, so here's what the people want to talk about. Well, if we put this on here as a racial quote unquote option here, then we're going to lose the racial differences we have among Latinos, which might be important to look at white Latinos, black Latinos, indigenous Latinos, et cetera. So when we saw the differences between the combined question format that was tested in the AQE and the 2010 census separate question model, here's what we saw. 52% checking white in 2010, between 9 and 16%, depending on the format, checking white in the combined model. About 37% checking other, less than 1% checking other. All of those went to the Latino Hispanic category. But you still had 2 to 3% who said black or American Indian or Asian. You had those smaller percentages were still there, but more than 70% say that they just wanted to check the Latino Hispanic. And more importantly, the re-interviews found a greater match between how they labeled on the form and how they actually consider themselves when you had the combined model. That is, when they called that person, they said, yes, I am a white Cuban, or yes, I am somewhat of mixed white and European background, and that's why I checked it. Versus when they called them and interviewed them regarding the separate questions format, if they checked white, it often didn't match how they saw themselves. Next slide. So here's the category. There were a number of different formats that were tested. Here's the one that basically the census put forward to OMB that they wanted to do for 2010. And you can see it has, I tried to make this as big as I could on the slide, but I still realized it may be hard to read. Under white, you have various white origin ethnic groups. Latino Hispanic is there next. Black or African American, with both African American and different, the most numerically It goes basically in order of the most numeric categories that you have for each of these things, basically. And so you had all these check boxes and the ability to be able to, this was a very symmetrical looking form. As another issue and complaint that people had regarding Latino Hispanic was that it was pulled out separate from the other groups. Some people who were interviewed with part of the AQE survey thought that was like stigmatizing, that why do you want to know this first about me? Whereas some whites thought it was giving privileges to Hispanic people because I don't get to say what my ethnic origin is, right? It also assumed, right, the separate questions, old model, that blacks and whites are just from the United States and doesn't ask them where they're from. So this made it very even. Everybody gets their larger box and everybody gets their ethnic origins under. We're not singling out anybody as being not from here. We're saying that we're putting everybody on par with each other, right? Unfortunately, because of changes in our government administration, OMB did not get a response to be able to move forward with this format. After over a decade of research and over 100 different community groups and civil rights groups that supported it, and many academics like myself, we were forced to stick with the separate questions model for 2020. Next slide. So the advantages that we would have had from being able to use this, and why I still hope that we'll be able to get this for 2030, is it allows one to identify solely as Latino Hispanic for one's race or origin or categories or however they put it, without having to choose from racial categories that don't fit. So Latinos don't have to be racial quote unquote others. Secondly, Latinos can still identify as white or black or any of the other races listed in the, basically on that. You don't have to just identify with that one category. Next slide. This format accommodates the different ways that many Latinos may see their identities. For some Latinos, this is their only racial category that they would want to identify with. For others, it may not be, but it basically allows for that fluidity of what it is in our actual communities, that there are differences in how this situates in our lives. Fourth, many Latinos felt stigmatized, I mentioned this just a moment ago, by the separate question. And so this made everyone more symmetrical and more even. It doesn't single out any groups as not being from here. Next slide. Here's what we ended up with for 2020, sadly. What I should also note, I forgot to mention this, we were on the slide earlier with this question up, is that it included the instructions in 2010 and in 2020 for this census, Hispanic origins are not races, which was also problematic. And some people felt in our communities because not being told that you're not a race also outright, which the census didn't say that they did not mean it to sound that way, but basically like that was how it was interpreted by people. And it was basically could then deflect and say that you should not identify yourself as Latino Hispanic. It's telling you it's not a race. Next slide. This was how we ended up with our race question. Now, interestingly, the Census Bureau did not need permission from OMB to ask for ethnic origins for whites or blacks. And so they were able to proceed with asking that, which helps somewhat in trying to evening things out, that we're also asking for origins for these groups as well. So this is what the format ended up looking like. Next slide. So here's what the racial responses were for 2020, and you can see a large decline in the identification of whiteness. We moved from 53% white to 20% white, and then you see other race remained sort of similar, 36%, around 40%, 36 to 42%. You do see then this large increase in 2 or more races. So some of this may be people of mixed background who are checking more than one race. Some of it might be, as Maria mentioned earlier, she's like, well, being Puerto Rican, I've been taught that we are white and black and indigenous. In the absence of having an option to say that you're Latino Hispanic, some people may, and being told that it's not a race, people will tick off boxes that approximate what they are, right, too. So some of this may be they're approximating, well, I am a little bit of this and this and this, and using those for the racial designators as well. Really, until we have an option for people to just say that they are Latino Hispanic in the format, we won't really quite know how well these reflect or map on to people's actual identities that they use in their daily life. Because when we don't have an option for them, we don't really know what they would have checked. Next response. Next slide. So my recommendations sort of moving forward, I'm running out of time here. The census should implement a combined question approach. I says for 2020, well, as 2020 research shows that this to be the best approach for capturing the Latino community as well as the MENA community. As social scientists conducting research on Latino populations, it's important that we include a racial option so we can improve our racial reporting. Next slide. And there's my contact information and a picture of my book for those of you who might be interested. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that very rich presentation. There's so much interesting information that you shared, and thank you for all the work that you did to investigate how to best capture Latino race and ethnicity. So we're now going to move on to Dr. Mark Lopez, who's going to talk to us about different approaches to measuring racial identity among US Latinos and how responses might differ depending on how you ask this question. Mark?
Great, thank you, Maria. And Julie, thank you for the great presentation. I always learn so much every time I listen to you speak about your work and your research. There's so much great stuff and everything that you have to share. And I think it's also important to keep in mind how much this is relevant for our conversations today, policy-wise, simply because the federal government is now rethinking our standards for reporting and capturing racial identity and ethnic identity among the U.S. public. But I'd like to share with you some findings from some of the research we've done at the Pew Research Center over the course of the last few years. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Seem to all of a sudden gotten a frog in my throat. First, I want to tell you though who we are at Pew Research. The Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and we don't take any positions on policy. So while we're talking about something that may have implications for policy, the center can't make any recommendations, nor can I. So some of you might ask me what we might need to do, and I'm going to say I don't know, but here's what our research shows, and point you back to some of our findings. Next slide. So recently, we did a survey of the Latino population. This was in 2021, that asked about racial identity in 4 different ways. So I'm going to share with you some of those findings. I also want to talk about some other work that we've done that have approached racial identity for the nation's Latino population in other ways that are different than the approach that the Census Bureau has used. But these are all meant to be different takes on how people might report their racial and ethnic identity. And I think it's important to keep in mind that before you even share any of these findings, that no matter what your research question is or how you shape your research question, that may determine what might be the best way to ask about racial and ethnic identity. So I want to share with you some different ways that we've done that, but I think it really depends a lot on the research question you're seeking to answer what might be the best approach to measuring racial or ethnic identity among the nation's Latino population. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this data was drawn from the 2021 National Survey of Latinos conducted by the Pew Research Center. This was fielded in March of 2021. We surveyed about almost 3,400 Latino adults, and we did so online. The online sample is composed of 2 parts. It's composed of 1,900 Hispanic adults from our what's called Pew Research Center America Trends panel, and also about 1,500 adults from the Ipsos Knowledge panel. Both of these are panels that have recruited people to participate in them and have done so in a way that is meant to make these representative of the national population of Latinos or the national population of U.S. adults. And so it's important to keep in mind that this is not a opt-in sample. This is one where people did agree to be a part of our sample, but we reached out to them and recruited people in a random way in order to be able to have a random sampling, just like we would in a telephone survey, of the population of Latinos. This was conducted in both Spanish and English, and it is nationally representative of the Hispanic population in the 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. Next slide. So we asked about, in this survey, Hispanic racial and ethnic identity in a few different ways. First, we did follow the Census Bureau's approach. Now, to get into the survey, to be part of the sample, we ask a question about, do you consider yourself Hispanic or Latino? That is lifted entirely from the Census Bureau's question about Hispanic and Latino identity. But we also had in this survey a question about race. And the approach we followed here was to take the 2020 census forms formulation and use that in our survey. Well, what did we find? And keep in mind, this is from 2021. So what did we find if we did it this way with the Census Bureau's approach? Next slide. What we found is that 58% of Latinos said that their race is white. And keep in mind, this is among Latino adults. 27% said some other race. 8% indicated 2 or more races, and 2% indicated Black. And you can see that the patterns here look very similar across the 2 different groups of Latinos, US born and foreign born. And of course, this may differ from what you see in the Census Bureau's own reporting of racial identity among Latinos, either in the 2010 census or any of the American community surveys that have followed, or even the 2020 census, partly because of the way in which we ask the question. So we have the two questions that are typical in the census form for the 2010 and 2020 census separate in the same survey. So they weren't right next to each other. And we also had many other questions in our survey about politics, about economics, the impact of COVID. This was a survey that was covering many different components, and it may have had influence on some of the responses that people gave in this particular question. Nonetheless, here's what we found when we asked the Census Bureau approach to race in our survey in March of 2021. Next slide. Now, we wanted to also approach this in a different way. What if you just flat out ask somebody, what's your race or origin, if you could describe yourself, how would you describe yourself? And here's what we got when we did it this way. Now, we had to code these answers because this was an open end, but next slide, we found the following set of responses. Among all Latinos, we found that 28% said that they would describe themselves as Hispanic or Latino, so in some form of one of the pan-ethnic terms. Another 28% indicated a country of origin in Latin America. 11% indicated American, 9% white, and 9% other races. And you can see how it varies here across immigrant generations, that they're particularly that third and higher generation is one that has a somewhat different racial and ethnic profile in this open end than what you see among, say, immigrant Latinos in the first generation. So very interesting findings here about racial and ethnic identity when you just ask about it in an open-ended question. Next slide. We also wanted to ask about skin color, because as you know, colorism is an important part of the experience of US Latinos and people in Latin America as well. And it's something that's part of the experience here in the United States too. So it has various components to it and various different experiences that I think are worth noting when we talk about this. But just asking people to self-assess their skin color, we asked Latinos to do so. And here's what we found. When we did that, we found that, next slide, we found that, for example, 80% of Latinos indicated or selected a skin color that is somewhere in the 1 to 4 categories here, so somewhere between 1 and 4, so the lighter skin categories, and about 15% identified or said their skin color was somewhat darker. Interestingly, this is both an interesting pattern and distribution of responses, but it's also interesting to see how it relates to some other factors, including discrimination, and I will come back to that in just a little bit. But it's also important to note that this may not necessarily match what we've seen in the two other necessarily map, I should say, well onto the two other response set of responses we got for the race question from the Census Bureau and our open-ended question, and I will come back to that as well. Next slide. We also asked this street race approach, something that Julie has been key in both creating, but also key in talking about a different way in which we might consider or think about how we ask about people's race. In other words, what do people think others consider them to be when they see them walking down the street? This set of responses also is a very interesting set of responses, and next slide, and it's something that again adds yet another dimension to the ways in which we might ask about racial and ethnic identity among Latinos. You can see here that 70% in our sample indicated that others likely see them as Hispanic, and this is something that's true across all the different generations, though across immigrant generations, that share who say that they think others see them as Hispanic starts to decline as we get to the third or higher generation. By the third or higher generation, 55% are saying so, still a majority, but you can see that 28% also indicate that they think others see them as white, and 9% think that others indicate that see them as mixed race or multiracial. Next slide. So what does this all mean? Well, interestingly, all of these don't necessarily line up. And I think that in thinking about some of Julie's research about this, there are many reasons why this may be the case, both in terms of what people want to tell officials versus how they see themselves. And so when you take a look at this combination of answers, the single most common combination that we observe in our data is somebody who indicates their skin color is lighter, who also says that they're white on the Census Bureau style format, indicate that their street race is Hispanic, but also indicate in the open end, they said they're Hispanic or Latino. That was 12% of our respondents who had that combination of responses. You can see there are other combinations here, but it's an interesting set of different types of combinations depending on whichever one we look at here. But nonetheless, there isn't quite a single pattern that overall dominates the set of responses here, indicating that there's a variety of responses depending on how you ask the question. Next slide. We also wanted to look at other ways of doing this in terms of asking about racial and ethnic identity among the US Latinos. Next slide. And perhaps most interestingly is the work that we've done on Afro-Latinos. We've had a lot of questions about Afro-Latinos and the number of Afro-Latinos living in the US over the course of the last decade. There's been growing interest in understanding both the experiences and economic differences within this population, but also compared to other Latinos and who identifies as Afro-Latino. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to use a national survey of the US population. So keep in mind, this is a survey of all US adults. And we asked US adults whether or not they consider themselves to be Afro-Latino or not. we found that among all US adults, 2% of the population says yes, they consider themselves Afro-Latino. Among Latino adults, this number would rise to 12%. So about 12% of all Latino adults indicate that they're Afro-Latino. But one of the unique findings from this particular research is we found that not all people who say they're Afro-Latino also indicate that they're Hispanic. In fact, about 800,000 people are in this group. That is, they say they're Afro-Latino, but do not self-identify as Hispanic. Taken together with those who are self-identifying as Hispanic and saying that they're Afro-Latino, we estimate that there's about 6 million people in the US who are Afro-Latino. Now, this is a different approach because this is directly asking people about Afro-Latino identity, which in some sense is not necessarily just a racial identity, but is more or different than that because it's about culture, it's about an identity that is personal in some ways, that is different than just a racial identity. However, I do want to stress that you oftentimes will see research that's done that oftentimes takes Census Bureau data and takes people who say they're both Black and Hispanic and equates that to the Afro-Latino population. If you look at that size of that population, the 2019 ACS, that number is only about 2.5 million people. So our estimate of 6 million is larger than the estimate one gets when you use an ACS approach of taking people who say their race is Black and also indicate that they say that they're Hispanic and equating that to Afro-Latinidad. So I would be very cautious about any Census Bureau based analysis that doesn't try to take into account the fact that that may be an underestimate of the size of the nation's Afro-Latino population. Next slide. We've also asked about multiracial and mixed race identity directly by asking people whether or not they consider themselves Mestizo, for example. And we found among Latino adults, 27% say yes, they do consider themselves to be Mestizo. So again, here is another very interesting approach. One that's direct rather than having people check boxes, asking people about a particular identity which has a label and a set of concepts in different countries across Latin America. Particularly I'm thinking about Mexico here, but that it has a concept that may be a little bit different than the way we think about things here in the US. Next slide. And we've done the same with indigenous identity by giving people indigenous groups as part of a list here to identify with. And when you do that, we found that about 13% of Latino adults in the US identify as indigenous, or as we said, American Indian. And then of course we gave a number of examples here. These are just some of the ways at the Pew Research Center we've tried to address this. And then I'd say that, next slide, one of the things I think is most interesting and important about all of this is that the ways in which we ask about this oftentimes reflects the ways people want to think about themselves. So we want to try to capture, or at least let people tell us how they want to be identified. One other interesting finding here, taking those Afro-Latino, indigenous, and mestizo respondents and looking at their racial how they responded to the race question on a census style question, the standard census question, you'll see here that there's quite a different set of responses here. So for example, among Afro-Latino adults, 28% indicated that their race is white, 25% indicated that their race is Black. Interestingly, among those Afro-Latino adults who say that they are Afro-Latino but don't self-identify as Hispanic, about half will say that their race is Black. So very interesting set of responses. I have a great report on that if you'd like to take a look at it. Among indigenous and among mestizo Latinos, you can see that the share who indicate that they're white is at 39% and 46%. Significant share saying some other race or two or more races. But it is interesting to see that the distribution of responses to the census style question is distinct for each one of these different groups that we asked about and we captured in our survey from 2019. Next slide. Finally, when I had mentioned earlier that why do we care about this and how does the choice of the measure matter? When we talk about different experiences, or we're trying to talk about something that might be related to policy, in this case, discrimination experiences, it might be worthwhile to think about alternative approaches to measuring racial and ethnic identity. So here I wanted to show you what happens if we cross our measures of discrimination experiences against skin color. So we broke down the population of Latinos into two groups, lighter skin and darker skin Latinos, and we looked at the differences in experiences with discrimination based on a list of questions that we had in the same survey. Overall, 54% of Latino adults tell us that they've experienced one of these 8 incidents that we asked about, and again, this was in March of 2021. But as you can see, across every single one of these incidents that we asked about, darker skinned Latinos are more likely to say this has happened to them than lighter skinned Latinos. So still, lighter skinned Latinos are also experiencing a significant amount, or a significant number are experiencing at least one of these experiences. But I want to point you to a couple of different findings here. First off is on the third row, you can see there's something about experienced discrimination by someone who is Hispanic. One of the interesting findings of this report is that the discrimination among Latinos is not only happening to Latinos, but is happening within the Latino population. And this is why the skin color approach may be a good approach to take when thinking about discrimination, particularly among Latinos. Well, what happens among Latinos and why discrimination based on skin color? Many of you may have had experiences where a grandmother, an aunt, or an uncle had talked about the importance of who you marry and the skin color of the person who you marry. Or people have emphasized your skin color. And in my case, people would oftentimes call me Casper the Ghost or Güerito, or well, various other things too, highlighting my lighter skin color because I'm the lightest skinned person in my family. Everybody else is much darker skinned than I am. So it is interesting to see that Latinos tell us that they're experiencing discrimination, and that those who are darker skinned are more likely to experience discrimination from other Latinos than lighter skinned Latinos. Next slide. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot of really great work here. But again, I want to stress that these alternative measures are interesting and important to think about, but that one really needs to consider the research question you're attempting to answer. And if the research question you're attempting to answer is one that lends itself well to a particular measure of racial identity, then designing a bespoke survey to capture that would be great. But oftentimes, I will say we have what we have. And oftentimes that's a Census Bureau approach, whether that's directly from Census Bureau data or even from data that comes from various, for example, administrative intake forms, or even from public opinion polling work or exit polls. The approach of the Census Bureau generally has shaped the way in which we ask about race and ethnicity in the country across a number of different projects. So if you get a chance to design your own survey, I might recommend thinking about alternative ways to ask about racial identity among Latinos. However, oftentimes we're limited by what's available, and it's important to be critical of what you do have, just in case. Next slide. You can find me here if you like to, and I look forward to your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing such interesting findings and offering some alternatives to how we ask about race and ethnicity. And before we open it up for a Q&A, I want to note that race and ethnicity are just one or two aspects of the Latino identity, right? The Latino population is incredibly diverse, and it's important to capture that diversity in our studies and when we design policies and programs. Several years ago, actually, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation convened a Hispanic research work group that developed some guidance on how to capture the diversity of the Hispanic population better in surveys by including additional data elements that include Hispanic ancestry, respondents and their parents' country of birth, U.S. citizenship, time in the U.S., language spoken at home, English speaking proficiency, literacy in any language, education level, and legal residency. And to help researchers in identifying data sets that contain these data elements, the center did a scan of 34 large, mostly national data sets, and documented the extent to which these data sets contained these 10 key data elements. So we have an interactive data tool online that you can go to see which data sets have what. So I encourage you to visit our website using this QR code to learn more. And now we're going to open it up for Q&A. We have some questions that have already come in, and there's a lot of questions actually about the use of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. So I'm wondering if our panelists can say something about what the differences between the different terms are, which we should be using in surveys, and any thoughts that you have around the topic.
Yeah. Julie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, for those not as familiar with terms like Latinx or the newer one Latine that are coming out, these are sort of gender neutral terms because Latino ends with an O, right, which is masculine, basically, even though it's used for everyone, basically, people have said, or in the O/A, which you might have noticed in my slides, I have a little bit of everything, right? And part of that is just because I think that it's just sort of like I'm fairly open to whatever terms people like to use. I'm in the classroom a lot. I teach, Latino Studies department prior to moving to sociology and Latino studies at UIC, and my students use a range of different things, right? And so I kind of mix it up a little bit in the classroom and in my presentations to make everybody feel like I mentioned them and their preferred label at least once, right? So these categories, there's the gender neutral, Latino, Latinx, Latine. I would say that having it, if you have a specific survey, it kind of depends on who you're surveying, right? If you're surveying a group that you expect, kind of like what Mark was saying too, right? About like how you want to ask about race probably depends on how you want to do your survey and what exactly you want to get from that, right? Because sort of like if you want to look at census stuff, right, skin color isn't always going to match, right? So we're asking, for example, like street race, right, on the census, right? Well, I teach a mixed race class. I have students who might be read as brown on the street and therefore Latino, even though they're actually like biracial, black and white, and they don't want to be included as Latino, right? So you want to have forms basically that capture how you want to where I'm going here, how you want to design your studies and be based on what kind of information you want to have, basically. And with the categories too, you want to use categories that are going to reach the community. If you're working with a community that you don't expect to really use a lot of Latinx, then you wouldn't use that. When I go to Texas, I will often use Hispanic when talking to my family because that's what they use, right? So you want to use whatever's going to work with whatever community you're working with, is my answer for that.
In some of the work that we did at the Pew Research Center, including our most recent survey we just published last week. This is a survey of U.S. adults about politics. But we did ask in it what term people prefer to describe the population. Do they prefer Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, or do they have no preference? About 60% indicated Hispanic is the term that they prefer to describe the population. About another 20 or so percent say Latino, and just 3% said Latinx, and there's a remainder that say no preference. This isn't far off from what we've found over the last 20 years, that generally speaking, Hispanic has been the term that most people in this population prefer to use to describe themselves. So take that for what it is. Now, why do we do this? I think it's important for me to tell you methodologically why we did this. In our surveys, we try to do the following. So if you're designing a survey and you're going to be asking people about pan-ethnic labels, or are going to be asking people about the population, the community, it might be worthwhile to ask them about the pan-ethnic labels and their preference, because then you could program it in to every single question later on where you ask, do you think the Latino community has been blah, blah, blah? Or do you think the Democratic Party cares about US Hispanics? So then you can plug it in accordingly, and that's exactly what we do in our surveys in order to at least try to accommodate the ways in which people self-identify. On Latinx and Latina, Latinx is a term that's emerged more recently, and as it's been around for a while, but it's become more popular in its use more recently, particularly among people who are celebrities, academics, researchers like ourselves. We have found, though, in our surveys that most Latinos, most people in the population have not heard of the term. So it seems unusual to use this term in a blanket way when most people don't even know what it is. So just to give you some sense of that, back in 2019, 75% of Latinos told us they'd never heard of the term. And I don't think that's changed much since. So there are a lot of nuances here when it comes to these terms and which is the best term. On a one-on-one basis, I usually try to let people tell me what they want, but I will say, Julie, you're right that geography matters and who you're talking to matters. So in LA, I will say Chicano, and in Texas, I will try very hard to say Mexican American or Hispanic. In New York, I might say Latino, and in Florida, I will say Hispanic. So again, it depends on the audience, but I have found that different groups have different preferences here, and oftentimes it's really the country of origin that people prefer, frankly.
Thank you.
Echo Mark's comment there about, so in my when I interviewed people, I did exactly what he described in the survey, where like I asked them what they choose first for their identity, and then for the rest of the study, like basically I use that term. So if you have a way to formulate it into whatever, if those scholars who are looking at this webinar, right, if you have a way to do that with your survey where you ask them early on, Latino, Latinx, or whatever, and then use that for the rest of it, if it could just insert into the questions, that's the best way I think to go about, where you're validating people's identities and what they prefer to use.
Those are great recommendations. So bottom line, consider your context and use the term that makes most sense in that context. And if you're able to tailor your materials to the terms that resonate with the population that you study, then one should try to do that. Those are great recommendations. Thank you. And this question is specific to Mark's research. So regarding the people who identified as Afro-Latino but didn't identify as Hispanic, is it possible that they are Brazilian and identify as Latino but not Hispanic?
It's possible. In our survey, though, we asked people, are you Hispanic or Latino? So they could identify as Latino. But it is a really great question, because I will say that many Brazilians are, usually when I do a presentation in front of an audience that might have folks who are Brazilian heritage, folks will oftentimes ask me, how come you don't include us in your definition? It's not that we don't, it's the way the federal government has defined it. And so there is a formal definition, and of course it has implications for the way people are classified in the census and coded in the census. However, in our work, we don't. So sometimes our surveys of Latinos do include people of Brazilian origin, Filipino origin as well, sometimes Italian, sometimes French. But if somebody self-identifies as Hispanic or Latino, we're not going to undo that. So we don't go back and back code it. But people have to self-identify. So yes, there are Brazilians in there, and yes, it may be that in this large national survey, that's exactly what happened, but I don't know. We'd need to go deeper on that, and we don't have the origins of everybody in that survey.
Thank you. And relatedly, so I think this question is for Julie. Is there a reason why the census is including Hispanics and Latino in the same box? Are they being treated interchangeably?
Okay. They're basically treated as interchangeable for the purposes of the census, right? So for the purposes of the census, and this kind of goes back to when I talked about Cristina Mora's book, Making Hispanics, right? The creation of the category, it's actually a language/ancestry category for the census. It's people of Spanish-speaking origins or ancestries. And so that Latino Hispanic they're both used to mean the same thing. So if you are, Latino Hispanic, you check that and you write in that you're Brazilian, they will remove you. Basically, they edit you out. So they don't do marks taken anybody who says their self-identification. The Census Bureau will remove people who indicated something else that does not, and it includes Brazil. Belize is not official, their official language is not Spanish for the country, even though it's one of the languages spoken there. So it doesn't actually include all of Latin America in what they concluded to be Latino Hispanic. And so they're using them together, and they're using them as Spanish origin or ancestry. Other scholars would maybe include Brazil in with Latino, but maybe would not include Spanish in with. But Spain and Spanish is included in Latino for the purposes of the census, right? So it's strictly Spanish-speaking origins or ancestry. But if you're a scholar doing research on this and you want to use your category, you can define it in a different way. If you want to include Brazilians, you can. If you want to exclude Spain and say, I want to do Latin American origins, you can do that. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Another question about the census question is, so if we're changing the way that we're capturing race and ethnicity, can we track demographic changes over time, or what problems does this present in terms of tracking demographic changes over time if the question itself is changing?
Yeah, that's exactly, this is the challenge. And it's a challenge for a number of reasons, just to be able to trend something. But it's a challenge in a lot of other ways. Trending is a problem in so many ways, different mode effects, different ways we do things in the census, as it was done differently this last time, for example. So there's a number of things that might influence sort of making comparisons across time. But also, I would note that the American public has changed the way that it thinks about these identities as well. So even if we didn't change the question, what those questions mean is really tied to the specific moment that that census questionnaire or that census is done, or any survey is done. So yes, it's a challenge. If we change these, it's definitely going to be a challenge. As a methodologist, you're going to have to note that there was a change in the way that we ask the question. However, at the same time, what we think of as a particular racial identity has changed over the decades. And even if the name and the question hasn't changed or the label hasn't changed, the way the public perceives it has. And so we need to be cautious about that too. So I'd say that, yeah, you're gonna have to have a methodological note, but I think things are changing anyway in a number of ways, and you have to be aware of that too.
Right, and remembering that this is a social construction, right? Like I mentioned earlier, and it just reflects how people are identifying themselves. It's not a biological race that we're assessing. Sorry, Julie, did you want to add anything?
Oh, no, I like to give my students like I have a table that's a history of how the race has been on the census and how it's changed over time. And so it has, like, Mexican was on there in 1930, and then it was removed because Mexican Americans protested it and didn't want. This is the time. This is the 1930s. People don't want to be. They don't want the government knowing where they live. They don't want to be deported. This is a time period where people did not want that type of attention on themselves, right? And so, like, so it's changed. What's considered to be a race or ethnic background, there used to be levels of blackness. They used to have octoroon, mulatto, quadroon. I mean, so it is all. Hindu was on there at one point, right? So we had religion and ethnicity also sort of, you know, like conflated there. So it's changed quite a bit over time, you know. And when I say that, what this makes me think of when people kind of push back a little, not that the questioner was pushing back. I mean, this is just this is a technical issue for how you want to handle your survey over time, right? But some of the pushback that we got in 2000 when we moved to check more than one race. There were some people who were losing their minds over this. There were some demographers who were PAA who were losing their minds, these poor people that were like, what if the data is going to explode? How am I ever going to be able to do anything? There's going to be a million different racial combinations. You know, and we did it, and the sky didn't fall down. Everything moved on, and now everyone does check more than one race for the most part, right? And like, and it's okay. So I think we move this to a different direction, and it's already that way at a lot of forums anyway for people, for a lot of state level other things where they put Latino, Hispanic in there. It's not going to be that huge of a difference. I think people would adjust to it.
I might add one other thing here that I think is important to note as well, is that how we report these results too is an important question that I think we should be thinking about. And the results of the 2020 census highlight how much people are aware of the different backgrounds that they have, that they're choosing more than one race, for example, to report. Yes, some of that is due to coding from the Census Bureau, but a lot of Americans are choosing to say, I am this, and I am this, and I am this. Well, does that mean that we treat them as a single race, non-Hispanic category, mutually exclusive from everything else? And which one of the races do we choose then? That really, I think, becomes a challenge. And so we have to also rethink the way in which we report out findings. To use the language of the Census Bureau, we should be reporting findings for alone or in combination, say for the Black population or for the white population or for the Asian population. That means that there isn't going to be these nice and neat mutually exclusive categories that make it easy to do statistical testing. You're going to have to be a little bit more sophisticated in that if you want to do it. But it I think more accurately reflects the ways in which the public thinks of itself. And as researchers, I think we haven't quite jumped on that bandwagon yet, or if there even is a bandwagon on that like that in research. But it's something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how we can do that at Pew Research to adjust how we report race and ethnic findings.
Just to sort of piggyback on Mark's comment there, that is something. So while Latino Hispanic has been a separate question, they've always pulled them out. And so there's often like Latino Hispanic, and then it's like non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks. And that's what, if it's in there with everything else, you know, they also pull out the 2 or more race folks usually. So then if you're putting Latino and Black, will you end up in the 2? So this is a big question, right? So like, how will we then treat the category if we can put it on there with everything else, which again, I'm advocating for? Can we still pull out all the Latinos basically? And this has been a big political question people have been asking, because those numbers really matter and people don't want to lose. It was frankly a big political question in 2000 when the mixed race thing, more than one race was happening, because some folks in the African American community were like, wait, if people are checking Black and white, are they still going to be Black? Are they still going to be in our group? Because those numbers matter to people for their communities. And so there's I think this similar kind of dynamic is going to be happening here on what to do with when it's in there. Will it be, if you check more than one, in with the more than one, or will it just be pulled out the way it used to be?
Great. Thank you. And I have time maybe for one more question. So somebody asked in the audience if maybe some Hispanics become more white across generations, even though they may have a grandparent who identifies as Hispanic. Do we have any research on that in 1 minute that we can share?
Yeah, we do. This is essentially perhaps a look at the ethnic attrition research agenda, research that's been done by others, not agenda. But at Pew Research, we did do a survey on this a few years ago. We went out and found people who say that they are of Hispanic ancestry, but don't self-identify as Hispanic. We wanted to look at the racial profile of those folks. And yeah, they're more likely to say that they're white, for example, than those who self-identify as Hispanic. And then, of course, by immigrant generation, things vary. But we also found that among those who have this Hispanic ancestry, so they had a grandmother that was Mexican, for example, they never really thought about themselves as Hispanic. And they wanted to know, although they wanted to know that ancestor and they would like to learn how to speak Spanish, but they aren't quite sure what they are. So they say they're of Spanish origin as opposed to Mexican or Cuban origin. Some really fascinating stories there for a group that has the ancestry, knows about it, but doesn't self-identify. And I'm sure we all know somebody who is like this, who will say, yeah, I know I have this ancestry, but I don't feel like I identify as part of the group. Mm-hmm. That's also true of many people who are 2 or more races. Not everybody who's in that group will say that they are multiracial. They'll say they're 2 or more races and they don't identify with the multiracial movement. This applies in so many different ways. So it's important, I think, to be aware of this. But yeah, Hispanic identity is changing because of intermarriage. Intermarriage rates for Latinos are among the highest, and they've been high for decades compared to other groups. So without a new infusion of immigrants, we would start to see a mixing that would lead to a Latino identity that could be very different in 40 years than what it is now. Immigration hasn't stopped, though. It's picking back up. And so this isn't going to change right away, but it's a long run story that I think is worth being aware of.
Great, thank you. I am both. Oh, sorry. Did you want to add something quickly?
Well, there's a really great book called Generations of Exclusion by Eddie Tejas and Vilma Ortiz, which looks not about the interracial marriage type stuff, but basically over time you saw increasing exclusion basically of the multiple generations, right? And so their book basically details something that looks a little bit different, a downward assimilation, right, that occurs. And so you have some stuff about that. You have Jessica Vasquez Tocos's book basically, which is also about sort of over time there's still persistent racialization that happens. So I think there's evidence that shows that multi-generational Mexican Americans are still living in lower income backgrounds, are still experiencing racism and discrimination for sure. I think when you have intermarriage, like what Mark's mentioning, if someone has only a fraction of their heritage of whatever background, whether it's Asian, Latino, Black, even Black, right? Someone who only has a very fraction of something may or may not see that as being a big part of their life, whether it's Native American, or any ancestry. So that can certainly happen over time for people.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up. I wish we had another hour because the discussion is so great, but we want to thank our wonderful panelists and our very active audience and our funder for your support. So thank you so much, and we'll be sharing the recording at a later time. Thank you.